The morning light filtered through the high windows of courtroom 4B, illuminating the polished wood and casting a sterile glow over the faces of the jury. Among them sat Samuel Price, a quiet, unassuming man who'd always believed that the justice system was, at its core, fair. He was a man who followed the rules, trusted authority, and believed that the truth, if given time and space, would always rise to the surface. But as Malcolm Turner was wheeled into the room, Samuel felt the first faint crack in that belief. Malcolm, a black man in his 40s, sat motionless in his wheelchair, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His face was unreadable, no flicker of fear, no sign of defiance, just a calm, steady presence that seemed strangely out of place for a man accused of defrauding the government. According to Brian Caldwell, the prosecutor, Malcolm had spent years fabricating documents to siphon money from federal aid programs. The evidence, Caldwell promised, would speak for itself. The man presiding over the case, Judge Leonard Whitaker, exuded authority the moment he stepped into the room. Tall, sharp-eyed, and cold, Whitaker carried himself with the air of someone who had long since stopped questioning his own power. He wasn't just the law, he was the final word. From the first glance he gave Malcolm, it was clear to Samuel that the judge had already made up his mind. This wasn't a trial, it was a performance. Brian Caldwell approached the jury with the ease of a man who knew the outcome was already assured. His suit was crisp, his every gesture practiced to perfection. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth as glass, "the evidence speaks for itself." He gestured to the neatly arranged folders stacked on the prosecution's table, pristine, without a single misplaced document or margin note. Everything about this case was too clean, too perfect. Real life, Samuel knew, was messy. But here, every piece fit seamlessly into the next, as if someone had choreographed it. As Caldwell began laying out the evidence, financial records, signed forms, perfectly traced transactions, Samuel felt the first prick of unease. The story was too airtight, too polished. In his own line of work as an insurance claims adjuster, Samuel had seen enough real investigations to know that truth left fingerprints, smudges, inconsistencies, gaps that no one could fully explain. But there were none here. It was as though the story had been written before the trial even began, and now they were all just filling in their assigned roles. Malcolm's attorney, Thomas Garrett, was experienced and thorough, but he might as well have been speaking into the void. Every time Garrett raised a valid point, questioning why the evidence was so flawlessly aligned, why no audit had ever flagged issues before, Judge Whitaker cut him off. The gavel came down hard, Whitaker's tone making it clear that no real challenge would be tolerated in his courtroom. There was no room for nuance, no interest in exploring the possibility that Malcolm might be innocent. The narrative was set. Malcolm Turner was guilty. They were all just here to make it official. Samuel scanned the faces of his fellow jurors, looking for some sign that someone else felt it too, that itch beneath the skin, that sense that the truth wasn't being served here. But every face he saw was blank, resigned. Some nodded along with Caldwell's statements, others avoided eye contact altogether. No one wanted to be the first to break the spell. No one wanted to stand out in a courtroom ruled by a man like Whitaker. Malcolm sat silently, watching the proceedings with a calmness that unsettled Samuel more than any outburst could have. There was no begging, no desperate plea for mercy, just quiet observation. It was the patience of someone who had already made peace with the fact that the system wasn't built for men like him. And yet, there was something else in Malcolm's eyes, something Samuel couldn't quite name, but which felt like a warning. The story wasn't over yet. By the time the first day ended, Samuel knew what the rest of the trial would look like. The evidence would continue to fit too perfectly. Garrett would continue to be silenced. Whitaker would steer the proceedings with an iron hand, ensuring that no inconvenient truths slipped through the cracks. The jury, himself included, would be expected to nod, agree, and convict, not because they believed it, but because resistance felt impossible. As Samuel walked out of the courthouse that evening, the air felt heavier than when he arrived. The courtroom was supposed to be a place where truth came to light, where the powerless were protected from the powerful. But what he had seen was something very different, a machine designed to protect itself, where truth was less important than appearances, and where silence was the price of belonging. Malcolm Turner's fate, it seemed, had been sealed before the first witness was sworn in. And yet, as Samuel sat in his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that Malcolm knew something they didn't, that somehow, beneath the weight of all that silence and control, the truth was still waiting for its chance to be heard. The second day of the trial unfolded under a weight that Samuel Price could almost feel pressing down on his shoulders. The tension wasn't loud, and no one spoke of it directly, but it was there, in the way people sat, in the way Judge Leonard Whitaker held the room in his grip, without raising his voice. Samuel had expected the courtroom to feel like a forum for truth, a place where evidence would be picked apart, questions would be welcomed, and justice would be pursued with patient care. Instead, it felt like a performance where everyone already knew their lines, and no one dared to improvise. The other jurors, his fellow ordinary citizens, seemed to sense it too. Some sat perfectly still, their hands folded neatly in their laps, as though afraid to even shift in their seats. Others fidgeted, fingers tapping nervously against armrests or smoothing invisible wrinkles in their clothes. No one spoke. No one questioned. There was an unspoken understanding in that room. You do not challenge Judge Whitaker. Whitaker wasn't an overt tyrant. He didn't need to be. His power was quieter, but far more dangerous. It was in the way his gaze lingered, just a beat too long, on anyone who hesitated. It was in the quick, clipped way he dismissed objections from Thomas Garrett, the defense attorney, before they could gain traction. It was in the way he subtly but unmistakably signaled to the jury that the case was already decided. His authority hung over the room like a storm cloud, and everyone, from the bailiffs to the spectators, knew better than to stand under it. Malcolm Turner sat at the defense table, still and silent, his hands folded on the table before him. His expression never changed. He didn't look defiant or angry, but neither did he look afraid. That, more than anything, unnerved Samuel. Malcolm's composure wasn't the kind that comes from resignation. It was the kind that comes from knowing something no one else knows. The prosecution's case was too perfect. Every document lined up flawlessly, every signature perfectly in place. Every piece of evidence fitting together like a machine designed to produce only one outcome: guilty. And yet, Garrett, the defense attorney, tried. Time and again, he rose to question the convenience of the evidence, pointing out that investigations rarely produce such clean trails, that real life is messier than this polished case. Each time, Judge Whitaker cut him down. "We are not here to entertain conspiracy theories," Whitaker said, his voice low but sharp, his gavel coming down like a door slamming shut. "The evidence is clear. Let's move on." Samuel shifted in his seat, fingers tightening on the arms of his chair. The fear wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the kind of fear that creeps in slowly until it becomes part of the air you breathe. He saw it in the eyes of the other jurors who avoided meeting his gaze. They knew, just like he did, that something was wrong, but no one wanted to be the first to say it. No one wanted to stand out, to challenge a man like Whitaker in his own courtroom. That was how silence became the norm, not because people agreed, but because they were too afraid to dissent. Samuel wasn't naive. He knew how power worked. But seeing it operate so smoothly, with so little resistance, was still chilling. The system wasn't broken in some dramatic, explosive way. It was broken quietly, through fear, through complicity, through the simple refusal of good people to speak. Even Brian Caldwell, the prosecutor, played his part to perfection. His voice was calm, confident, full of the authority that comes from knowing the judge is firmly on your side. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence speaks for itself," he repeated, his tone gentle, almost comforting, as though he was helping the jury come to the only possible conclusion, easing them into their role as accessories to injustice. Samuel wanted to speak, to raise a hand, to ask a question, to break the script. But every time he opened his mouth, the weight of the room settled on him again, reminding him that this was not a place for questions. It was a place for obedience. He thought of Malcolm, sitting there quietly, the accused man at the center of this storm. Malcolm must have felt that weight tenfold, yet he remained unshaken. That calm unnerved Samuel more than any outburst could have. Why wasn't he afraid? Because Malcolm knew the truth, not just about this case, but about how the system really worked. He knew that Whitaker's power depended entirely on the silence of the people around him. And Samuel, whether he liked it or not, was becoming part of that silence. As the day dragged on, Samuel could feel the edges of his own fear hardening into something uglier: self-preservation. If he stayed quiet, if he followed the cues Whitaker was giving, he could get through this. He could go home, but at what cost? How many others had sat in courtrooms like this, innocent and alone, their fates sealed not by evidence, but by the silence of the good people sitting around them? The longer he sat, the clearer the truth became. Whitaker didn't need to threaten anyone. He just needed them to stay quiet. Samuel's stomach churned with the weight of that realization. He was part of the machine now. The words "guilty on all charges" rang out across the courtroom, delivered with the cold finality that Judge Leonard Whitaker had perfected over decades on the bench. His voice carried no trace of hesitation, no flicker of doubt. This wasn't justice being served, it was a performance reaching its final act. Every player had followed the script to perfection. Brian Caldwell presenting the evidence with surgical precision, Thomas Garrett futilely objecting until Whitaker silenced him, and the jurors, Samuel Price included, sitting in stunned compliance, afraid to disrupt the order imposed by the man in the black robe. For all intents and purposes, it was over. Malcolm Turner had been condemned, just as expected. The process had been completed, the system had worked, at least, according to Whitaker's definition of working. And yet, something in the air felt wrong. Samuel could feel it, though he couldn't name it. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground shifting beneath your feet before the fall begins. And then it happened. It began with a sound so soft it barely registered, the faint creak of wheels against polished floor. Samuel's attention snapped back to Malcolm Turner, who had sat still and silent throughout the trial. Slowly, deliberately, Malcolm placed both hands firmly on the arms of his wheelchair, and, with a grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics, he stood up. For a heartbeat, the courtroom froze. Samuel could hear someone's breath catch, a pen slipping from nerveless fingers to clatter against the floor. A man who had been presented as paralyzed, incapable of walking, was now standing tall. The impossible had become real, and with it, the neatly ordered narrative Whitaker had constructed began to unravel. Brian Caldwell's mouth hung open, his polished veneer crumbling under the weight of his own disbelief. His carefully orchestrated case, every piece of evidence he had laid out with such confidence, had just been reduced to theater. But the most striking reaction came from Judge Leonard Whitaker. The color drained from his face, his hands clutching the edges of his bench as though holding on to the last shreds of his authority. This wasn't part of his plan. In his courtroom, the defendant was supposed to be powerless, compliant, resigned, unable to stand in every sense of the word. But Malcolm was standing, and with that simple act, he flipped the entire power structure upside down. In one smooth motion, Malcolm reached into his pocket and withdrew a badge, flipping it open for all to see. His voice, calm but resolute, filled the room. Malcolm Turner, Special Agent, United States Department of Justice. The silence shattered. The courtroom, which had been held in Whitaker's grip for so long, exploded with whispers, gasps, and the sudden realization that this trial had never been what it seemed. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline flooding his veins as the truth crashed down around them. Malcolm took a step forward, no longer the accused, no longer helpless. Every movement radiated authority, real authority, not the counterfeit power Whitaker had wielded through intimidation and silence. "I've been investigating you for months, Judge Whitaker," Malcolm said, his voice carrying across the room like a hammer striking steel. "How many innocent people have you condemned? How many verdicts have you sold? How long did you think you could hide behind that robe?" Whitaker's fingers trembled against the bench. The mask of smug indifference he had worn so easily throughout the trial was gone, replaced by something raw, fear. The jurors, the spectators, even the court officers, all of them stared at Malcolm as though seeing him for the first time. Samuel felt a jolt of shame burn in his chest. They had all assumed they knew who Malcolm was, another defendant crushed by a system too big to fight. But Malcolm had never been powerless. He had only been waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the truth. Brian Caldwell took a shaky step back, as though physical distance could somehow shield him from the fallout. His hands, so confident when they held the prosecution's evidence, now hung uselessly at his sides. He had been part of this, a willing accomplice to the false narrative, and now there was nowhere to hide. Malcolm's eyes never left Whitaker's. There was no gloating, no satisfaction, only the weight of truth finally made visible. And with every passing second, Whitaker shrank beneath that weight. The man who had ruled this courtroom with unchecked arrogance now looked small, exposed as nothing more than a fraud in judicial robes. Samuel's breath came fast and shallow. The truth had been there all along, in the too perfect evidence, in Whitaker's iron grip on the proceedings, in Malcolm's silence that wasn't surrender, but patience. And Samuel, like everyone else, had let himself believe the lie because it was easier than standing up. But Malcolm had stood, and, in doing so, he had not only exposed Whitaker, he had exposed every person in that room who had stayed silent when they should have spoken. For the first time since the trial began, Samuel realized that the story hadn't been about Malcolm at all. It had been about all of them, the people who watched injustice unfold and convinced themselves they were powerless to stop it. Malcolm Turner had proven them wrong. The sound of the courtroom doors slamming open was like a thunderclap, breaking the stunned silence left in the wake of Malcolm Turner's revelation. A dozen federal agents, their movements crisp and rehearsed, poured into the room. Their presence transformed the atmosphere instantly. The room, which had for so long been dominated by Judge Leonard Whitaker's oppressive authority, was now ruled by something far greater: accountability. The agents moved with the certainty of people who had come to collect what was owed. And this time, the man in the black robe was the one in debt. For years, Whitaker had sat in judgment over others, towering above defendants, witnesses, and attorneys alike. His power had always felt absolute, unquestioned, and unassailable. He wasn't just a judge, he was the system, wrapped in the authority of the state. And anyone who challenged that authority was swiftly reminded who held the gavel. But now, the gavel meant nothing. The polished wood of his bench could no longer shield him. The black robe, once a symbol of control, now hung limp around his shoulders, its weight offering no protection. Whitaker's hands, which once rested so easily atop the bench, now gripped the edge with white-knuckled desperation. His breath came shallow, chest rising in sharp, panicked jerks. "No," he muttered, though his voice lacked the booming certainty it had once carried. "This is my courtroom. I am the law here." But even as he spoke, his voice faltered. It was no longer a declaration, it was a plea, and no one was listening. The agents reached him within seconds, moving with clinical efficiency. One agent took each arm, their grips firm but almost dismissive, as though Whitaker's struggles were irrelevant. The metallic click of handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the room, louder than the gavel had ever sounded. That small, sharp sound was the final verdict, not from Whitaker, but from the very system he had believed he could twist to his will. Whitaker thrashed, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. "You can't do this!" he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his own panic. "I'm a judge." But the badge Malcolm held, the authority of the Department of Justice, carried more weight than Whitaker's title ever had. And for the first time, Whitaker's power was meaningless. In the prosecution's corner, Brian Caldwell, the once confident prosecutor, took an instinctive step back. His polished composure, his carefully curated image of legal authority, had shattered. His fingers twitched at his sides, as though part of him still believed he could salvage the situation, but his eyes betrayed him, wide, darting, searching for a way out that didn't exist. He had been complicit, a willing partner in Whitaker's corruption, and now the entire room knew it. Malcolm stood calm amidst the chaos, his badge still visible, but his presence alone was enough to command the room. He had exposed Whitaker, not with volume or force, but with patience and undeniable truth. His posture radiated quiet authority, the kind built not on fear, but on the certainty that justice, though delayed, had arrived. The jurors, including Samuel Price, sat frozen in their seats, unsure whether to stand, to speak, or simply to watch. For days, they had been prisoners of Whitaker's control, following his cues, bending beneath the weight of his power. But now, they saw him for what he truly was, a man stripped bare of the symbols that once made him untouchable. Samuel's fingers loosened from the armrests of his chair. The tension that had gripped him since the trial began beginning to ease. The air in the courtroom shifted. Where there had once been suffocating silence, there was now a ripple of possibility, a sense that something had cracked open, that the power they had all feared was not invincible after all. The fear had always been a mirage, propped up by the belief that to speak out was futile. But Malcolm had proven otherwise. As the agents led Whitaker toward the door, his struggles grew more frantic. His voice, once a weapon used to silence others, now trembled with desperation. "You'll regret this," he shouted, his head snapping toward Malcolm. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I am the law." But the law had moved past him. The law, it turned out, was not the man in the robe, but the principle that no one, no matter how powerful, is beyond accountability. Whitaker's power, so carefully cultivated and so ruthlessly enforced, crumbled the moment someone dared to challenge it. Samuel exhaled, his breath shaky but lighter than it had been in days. For the first time, the air in the room felt clear. The spell had broken. Whitaker, who had ruled the courtroom like a king, was now nothing more than a man being led away in handcuffs. As the doors closed behind the agents, Samuel glanced around the room at his fellow jurors. They looked at each other, hesitant at first, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, their shoulders relaxed, their gazes lifted. They had all been part of Whitaker's machine, silent cogs turning because they were told to. But now the machine had stopped. Malcolm stood quietly near the defense table, no longer the defendant, but the man who had returned the courtroom to what it was meant to be, a place where truth could breathe again. Samuel knew the work wasn't finished. There would be more judges like Whitaker, more prosecutors like Caldwell, more trials where silence was expected. But for today at least, the silence had been broken. And for the first time, Samuel understood justice is not what the system produces, it's what ordinary people demand, even when it's terrifying. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom closed with a hollow finality, sealing away the chaos and spectacle that had unfolded inside. Samuel Price stepped out into the corridor, but the air outside the courtroom felt no lighter. His lungs expanded, but the breath that filled them felt weighted, not with fear, but with the crushing awareness of how close they had all come to becoming silent accomplices to injustice. Judge Leonard Whitaker had been led away in handcuffs, his power stripped away in front of everyone who had once feared him. But his removal was not the end of the story. If anything, it was only the beginning of a much harder truth. The system hadn't caught Whitaker. Not really. It hadn't protected the innocent or upheld justice the way Samuel had always believed it would. No, the system had enabled him, shielded him, allowed him to grow bold and untouchable. Year after year, Whitaker didn't seize power all at once. He took it in increments, in the silence of those who saw the warning signs and told themselves it wasn't their place to question. And Samuel Price had been one of them. The hardest truth, as Samuel stood there with his hands in his pockets, was knowing that people like him were the lifeblood of Whitaker's reign. Not villains, not accomplices in the active sense, just good, ordinary people who saw something was wrong and said nothing. Every time a juror felt uneasy but went along anyway, every time a lawyer hesitated to push back too hard, every time a clerk filed papers they suspected were fraudulent but didn't ask questions, those small moments, those tiny silences were the bricks that built the walls around Whitaker's power. That realization struck Samuel harder than any gavel had. He had been proud when his jury summons arrived, proud to play his part in upholding justice, proud to be one of the everyday citizens called upon to protect fairness in the legal system. He had believed in the purity of the process, in the idea that if everyone followed the rules, the truth would prevail. But now, after seeing how easily the rules had been twisted, how quickly the truth had been buried beneath fear and silence, Samuel understood the real mechanism of injustice. It wasn't just about corrupt men like Whitaker or polished prosecutors like Brian Caldwell who played along because it was easier. It was about the silence of everyone else, the ordinary people who convinced themselves that someone else would speak up, someone else would fix it. And by the time they realized no one would, it was too late. The machine had already been set in motion. Samuel thought about Malcolm Turner, the man they were all so quick to believe was guilty. Malcolm, who sat silently for days, not because he was defeated, but because he knew the truth could only be revealed at the right moment. Malcolm had placed his trust not in the system, but in himself, in his own courage to stand up and name the lie, even when the cost of doing so was immense. It was a courage Samuel had not found in himself until it was nearly too late. That was the lesson Samuel would carry with him long after this trial faded from the headlines. Justice isn't a product of the system, it's a product of courage. And courage is not loud, not always about dramatic speeches or grand gestures. Sometimes it's as small as raising a hand in the jury room, or asking the uncomfortable question, or refusing to nod along when everything inside you is screaming that something is wrong. Courage is what breaks the silence. For decades, Samuel had believed that silence was safer, that staying out of conflict, going along with authority, trusting the people in power was the path of least resistance. And maybe it was, but that path led straight into the heart of injustice. Men like Whitaker relied on people like Samuel, people who were too polite, too uncertain, too fearful to say, "This isn't right." As Samuel left the courthouse, the sun high overhead, the world outside felt unchanged. Cars still passed by. Conversation still hummed on the street. The system, with all its weight and inertia, still existed. But inside Samuel, something had shifted permanently. He couldn't unknow what he had seen. He couldn't forget how easily the silence had taken hold, or how close they had come to condemning an innocent man just to avoid rocking the boat. Justice had only prevailed this time because Malcolm had refused to be silent. Samuel knew that most people sitting in that defendant's chair wouldn't be Malcolm. They wouldn't have a badge in their pocket or a federal investigation to back them up. They would only have the hope that someone, anyone, in that courtroom might find the courage to break the silence. That someone should have been him. It would be next time. As Samuel Price walked down the courthouse steps, the sun warming his face, he felt a strange weight in his chest, not the crushing fear he'd carried into courtroom 4B, but something quieter, heavier, more permanent. It was the weight of awareness, the understanding that justice had only been served because one man, Malcolm Turner, had refused to be silent. Without Malcolm's courage, without his willingness to stand, both literally and figuratively, the rest of them would have followed the script, playing their assigned parts in a machine that had nothing to do with truth. Samuel's whole life, he had believed in the system. He had believed that if people obeyed the rules, if they presented facts, if they followed the procedures, justice would naturally emerge. That belief was comforting, a way to make sense of a chaotic world, but the trial had shattered that illusion. What he saw inside that courtroom was not justice unfolding, it was a performance, orchestrated by Judge Leonard Whitaker, propped up by Brian Caldwell, and silently enabled by everyone who knew something was wrong, but said nothing. That was the most painful realization, that Samuel himself had been part of the silence. It wasn't an active betrayal. He hadn't lied or planted evidence. But every time he swallowed a question, every time he chose to look at his hands instead of meeting Malcolm's eyes, every time he nodded along with the too-perfect narrative presented by Caldwell, he had contributed to the very system Malcolm was fighting to expose. And it was only through Malcolm's unflinching courage that Samuel's own silence became unbearable. The silence in that courtroom was not unique. Samuel could see it everywhere now, in the polite conversations where people avoided uncomfortable truths, in the workplaces where unethical behavior was excused to avoid confrontation, in families where old wounds festered because no one wanted to disturb the fragile peace. Silence is rarely passive, it is a choice, and that choice feeds injustice. Malcolm understood that. He hadn't just exposed Judge Whitaker, he had exposed the culture of silence that allowed men like Whitaker to thrive. Corrupt judges, biased prosecutors, intimidated jurors, they were all symptoms of a deeper disease. The belief that staying quiet was the safest path. But safety is a myth when silence is the price. Samuel could see that now. Every time someone chooses silence over truth, they build another brick in the wall that shields corruption from consequence. It was only when Malcolm stood, physically, emotionally, and morally, that the wall cracked, letting light pour into the darkness of that courtroom. Samuel knew that most people would never find themselves in a dramatic moment like Malcolm's, standing up before a room full of stunned faces to reveal the truth. But that wasn't the point. The real battle against injustice happens in the small moments, when someone asks a hard question, challenges an unfair rule, or refuses to pretend they don't see what's happening. Those moments, those tiny acts of courage, are what hold corruption at bay. Samuel's walk away from the courthouse was not triumphant. It wasn't a victory lap. It was a quiet, humbling realization that he had a responsibility he could no longer ignore. He couldn't go back to believing that justice was someone else's job. Justice was everyone's job, and it lived or died in the willingness of ordinary people to speak when it was easier to stay quiet. Malcolm Turner's strength wasn't in his badge or his authority, it was in his refusal to be part of the silence. Samuel couldn't change the past, but he could choose differently going forward. He would speak, even when his voice trembled. He would question, even when the answers were inconvenient. And most importantly, he would remember that silence is not neutrality, it is complicity. As Samuel reached his car, he took one final look back at the courthouse. The building hadn't changed. The system inside hadn't magically healed, but Samuel had. Because once you see how silence feeds injustice, you can't pretend you don't know. As we grow older, we begin to see the world differently. With the wisdom of years behind us, we recognize patterns, not just in the way people behave, but in how power works and how often the truth gets buried beneath silence and fear. One of the most important lessons life teaches is that injustice doesn't always arrive with a shout. More often, it creeps in through silence, through the moments when good people look away. The story of Malcolm Turner reminds us that silence can be just as dangerous as action. For years, people sat quietly in Judge Leonard Whitaker's courtroom, following the rules, assuming the system would sort itself out. No one wanted to cause trouble, no one wanted to stand out, but their silence allowed corruption to thrive. It's a reminder many of us understand all too well. How often in our own lives have we chosen to hold our tongues because it felt safer than speaking the truth? With age comes perspective, the understanding that justice doesn't simply exist. It's not a permanent structure that stands strong on its own. Justice is fragile, constantly in need of ordinary people willing to speak up, ask questions, and refuse to go along with something that feels wrong. Whether it's in a courtroom, in our communities, or even within our own families, the health of any system, legal, social, or personal, depends on the courage of people who refuse to be silent. This lesson is especially important for those of us who have lived through decades of change. We've seen what happens when silence allows prejudice, greed, or abuse to go unchecked. And we've also seen what happens when ordinary people, often in small ways, choose to break that silence. Courage doesn't always look like grand gestures. Sometimes it's simply asking, is this right? Even when no one else will. As elders, we have a unique role. Our years have given us stories, not just of what we've done, but also of what we've seen, what we regret staying silent about, and what we wish we'd had the courage to confront sooner. These stories are not burdens to carry alone, they are lessons to pass on. Our children, our grandchildren, and even our communities can benefit from the wisdom we've gained, but only if we choose to share it. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever held back your voice when you knew you should speak, let this be a reminder. It's never too late to speak your truth. Even now, your voice matters. If you believe stories like this need to be heard, we invite you to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that shine a light on truth and justice. And if you know someone who might need to hear this message, please share this video with them. Because the first step toward justice is breaking the silence. Together,